Hello, friends. Mike's MMA Picks here on a bit of a different type of show. This is a new concept. We're unveiling deep thoughts with Mike's MMA Picks, and I'm happy to be here with you as we take a look at fighters who potentially hung on far, far too long before opting for retirement. Now, I've been in a position where since the early 1990s, I've basically watched entire careers unfold before my very eyes. I remember watching George St. Pierre as he took to the octagon for the first time. And wow, you saw a talent there. And not many fighters are fortunate enough to walk away from the sport with their body intact, their mind intact, and having all of their wits as they ponder what comes next. And you look at the nature of the sport, you have the warrior mentality that a lot of these fighters possessed. They never give up. And even when the going gets tough, they get going. Some may say that pain is weakness leaving the body. You've heard that expression before. And in the 90s and early 2000s, we saw a lot of fighters overtraining. I remember Dan Henderson talking about how he overtrained in preparation for his title fight against Rampage Jackson. I believe that was a title unification bout where he was taking on Jackson, and he was the Pride champion. I was at um, Dan Henderson's fight versus Vanderlei Silva, and we saw you want to look at that side of the fight too. Vanderlei is a fighter who he seemed to hang on way too long and he was getting brutally knocked out. And we can walk through the list here. We have a comment already. Tony Ferguson. Now, you want to talk fighters that are currently on the UFC roster, fighters who've spent a lot of time making their hay. And I believe, what was it, a 12 fight winning streak that Tony Ferguson was on at one point, and the wheels have completely fallen off. The Michael Chandler performance, I believe the Justin Gaethje fight was something that it was hard to even listen to the strikes that were landing on Tony Ferguson by Justin Gaethje, putting him in real trouble. But you saw Tony Ferguson. He's somebody who will not quit on himself. And a few days after that fight against Gaethje, he was dancing around with his IV pole in the hospital, and he, I believe, is now what, 7 fights consistently losing 7 fights in a row, and he has no desire to retire and walk away from the sport. And I compiled a list of fighters who I remember um, they had the high skill level and they had that ferocious mentality that they brought to the cage each and every time out, where they would not give up, they would not succumb. And I'll walk through the list right now. We had so George St. Pierre was one of them, right? Uh, a fighter who you remember Greg Jackson and his fight where George St. Pierre was fighting, I believe it was Silva. Was it? Gotta look back. Oh, Thiago Alves. Yes, Thiago Alves um, versus George St. Pierre. And you remember in that fight, I believe it was George St. Pierre who tore his groin muscle, and Greg Jackson's like, I don't care, hit him with your groin. Um, and fighters like that, they find a way to win. At what cost, though? And it seems like, and you heard recently, I believe it was OAM who came out and spoke about George St. Pierre and how eloquent he was about walking away from the sport at the right time. And you have to have a plan B and plan C after you retire. It's very difficult to do that. So we talked about George St. Pierre. We talked about Vanderlei Silva, who tried to reinvent himself in Bellator, got humiliated against Chael Sonnen. Uh, let's talk Mauricio Shogun Hua. That is unfortunately a fighter who hung on way, way, way too long. And the fights against Dan Henderson were something that, oh man, was a real concern. By the way, let's say cheers to you on this festive evening. I want to thank everybody for tuning in. Mm, when it hits the lips. Excellent, excellent. So let's talk about Mauricio Shogun Hua, the Ricardo Arona fight. There are many, many others where Shogun showed us who he was. And this is a fighter who beat Alistair Overeem multiple times. Alistair Overeem is another fighter who I believe when you combine his kickboxing knockout losses and his mixed martial arts knockout losses, the number of knockouts that Alistair Overeem has suffered. Granted, how many people has he knocked out, right? But wow, he took the damage, and we can roll. This conversation could go on for hours. We can. When I just said the word damage, what comes to mind? Probably Darren the Damage Elkins. And you look at Darren Elkins and his fight, and his fight against Cub Swanson, and all of the fights that he's had where he's taken tremendous damage. And recently he suffered a broken leg. So our hearts and prayers go out to Darren Elkins as he tries to get back on the horse once again. A lot of people counted him out last time he competed inside of the octagon against TJ Brown, but he still has what it takes, as we've seen. He's a dog. He's going to fight hard for your money. So let's continue down the line, talk about fighters who hung on way, way, way too long, past their prime, past their expiration date. And another is New Jersey's own Frankie Edgar. Frankie Edgar, legend of the sport. You remember, man, what can you say? The fights against Gray Maynard, they showed you who Frankie was and who he is. And he's somebody who is willing to sacrifice himself inside of the octagon. And that's what makes this sport so fantastic to watch as a fan. I know we're not competing inside of the octagon. We have no idea what it really takes to lay it all on the line in front of 17, 18, 20,000 screaming fans. And you see fighters get knocked out, and then what does it take to get back on your horse? And I think of a fighter who hasn't returned in years, one of the most talented lightweights on the planet, and that would be Gregor Gillespie. Gregor Gillespie is a fighter who was brutally knocked out by Kevin Lee in front of President Trump and Madison Square Garden. And I believe he went on to fight one more time after that and won against who was it? It was a fighter from Fortis MMA. and Gregor Gillespie hasn't come back to compete. Gregor Gillespie is one of my favorite fighters on the roster. Great motor, great wrestling, will to win. And now he's getting up there. He's in his late 30s. Yes. Carlos Diego Ferreira. Jason, thank you for that. I appreciate it. By the way, let's throw your other comment up there. So we talked Shogun, BJ Penn. You want to go to Tapology and take a look at BJ Penn's professional record and the amount of losses he sustained towards the end of his career. Oh, tough to swallow. Tough to see legends. The challenge is also at this stage in their career, they're starting to make decent money, and sometimes it's on the tail end of their career that they're making this money. You look at Michael Chandler now. Michael Chandler, he's got this fight lined up against Conor McGregor, and Michael Chandler's taken his fair share of beatings inside of the octagon and the Bellator cage as well. And look there, you have Diego Sanchez. Diego Sanchez, who, oh man, you saw that fight against Kevin Lee, where Kevin Lee was, I think, a minus 800 favorite or so. And Diego, even as a shell of himself, was making it somewhat competitive against Kevin Lee. Kevin Lee had torn both ACLs at one point and made a comeback. And now I believe he's retired also. Now, look at what Kevin Lee did to his body. And you want to talk about fighters with limps who are barely getting by. I mean, uh, the Nogueira brothers, I ran into the Nogueira brothers in Las Vegas at Pride 33, and Sokaju had just brutally knocked out one of the Nogueira brothers. And I was walking back to the fighter hotel, uh, and I remember seeing them walking, and Frank Mears talked about this also, that uh, they are just hobbling around. And I know that there were some injuries that were sustained earlier in life, but um, it's a tough look. Uh, Wi-Fi, you mentioned Marlon Moraes. That's another fighter who, look at how many knockout losses in a row did he sustain. So how do you walk away? This begs the question: how do you walk away at the right time? When do you know it's the right time to step aside and walk away? And of course, a fan has no business telling fighters what to do. They need to have teammates who are not necessarily yes men. They need to have fighters and people who, coaches in their ear, who are going to give them sound professional advice. And sometimes you have to step away from that circle, I believe, to get that advice. And a lot of folks don't get it. That's pretty clear. I mean, you saw Frankie Edgar getting brutally knocked out at Madison Square Garden by Chris Gutierrez in front of his family, and that was a tough look. It didn't have to happen like that. They probably could have inducted him into the Hall of Fame at Madison Square Garden, and he would have gotten a very similar standing ovation there. So my heart goes out to Frankie Edgar, phenomenal fighter who did so much, so many great things at the lightweight weight class. And I remember I was at his fight against Spencer Fisher a long time ago, and we mentioned Spencer Fisher. That's somebody who you haven't seen in public in years, and he's a fighter who's sustained lasting damage from competing. So it's a dangerous sport. It's a sport where, as a fan, I enjoy watching the fights, but I also don't see what happens after these fighters arrive back home, or they're spending time in the hospital recovering from the injuries that they sustain. And the other thing that we have to consider is what we see on fight night isn't the whole picture. There's an entire training camp that takes place prior to these fights. And a lot of times, I mean, you talk about shoot box, and Vanderlei Silva and Anderson Silva was at one point with shoot box, and you watch the training footage of these guys beating the hell out of each other, and you wonder, how many concussions have these fighters, these elite fighters, sustained in the training room. And you have no idea. Honestly, no one has any idea until perhaps the cornermen know. That's about it. So let's continue to walk through this list. We've got a lot of fighters to talk about. How about Rory McDonald? I'm going to mention Rory McDonald. This is a fighter who, yes, he was in that hunt to make $1 million, right? And what ended up happening there? He's a fighter who, the Robbie Lawler fight showed us a lot. I mean, he basically sacrificed himself in that fight. And then the a fight that came after that, the Gegard Mousasi fight, was something that was an eye opener. He was bloodied and beaten, and I believe he was taking that fight up at 185 pounds. But that is an issue here for Rory McDonald, who hung on way too long and retired. Yes, he's still a young man in many regards, but he's a fighter who sacrificed so much. And Robbie Lawler, on the other hand, fighter who went out of his way to sacrifice himself. How about Fedor Emelianenko? Fedor is a fighter who gave it everything he had, and he was shot born about maybe 10, 12 fights ago. And here he is, and he's getting brutalized in his final fight. And that was a fight that didn't have to happen as well. So we talked Overeem, we talked Shogun. How about Chuck Liddell? Chuck Liddell's a fighter who hung on way, 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 way too long. We've seen him brutally knocked out. Even the fight against Rich Franklin, when Rich Franklin knocked out Chuck, that was something that I did not expect to happen in that fashion. And his lights went out real quick, real quick. And every chin has a shelf life, as we've said many, many times in the past. Let's continue. How about TJ Grant? You folks remember that name? Up and coming fighter who was on the cusp of a title fight and ended up having to retire due to, I believe, concussions and post-concussion syndrome. That was a situation where he just couldn't get back into camp, I believe. I think he was having headaches. We talked BJ Penn, we talked Tony Ferguson, and then you have fighters who somehow, some way, their longevity, their durability stays with them, and they're able to perform into their 40s. You think of Stephen Wonderboy Thompson, who's only been knocked out, I believe, once in mixed martial arts against Anthony Pettis, which was that Superman punch fluke KO. And you think of Alexei Olnik. Alexei Olnik is another fighter who shockingly was able to keep it going for a long, long, long time. And now you have to wonder, he has all those Ezekiel chokes, but he's also been knocked out a bunch of times. What's in store for his future as well. And optimally, these fighters need to have a plan B and a plan after the fight game ends. It's hard to do that, though, when you're 100% in, you're all in, and you're planning everything around the fight game and the camp, and nothing else matters besides this opponent in front of you. You can't look past them. And the other thing is we had fighters who are willing to take risks and cheat. TJ Dillashaw is someone who comes to mind. I mean, the guy was taking EPO, and look what he ended up doing to Renan Barão. Renan Barão was never the same after TJ fought him the first time, and then the second time we saw what happened, and you had Brian Kelleher destroying Renan Barão, and man, Renan Barão, it's sad what ended up happening to him and towards the end of his careers. And what is he doing? I believe he's been trying to get a fight and compete because some fighters know no other way. Then you had Chad Mendes, who's made his hay in bare knuckle boxing recently, which is a bit of a shock how he's been successful to some degree there. And I believe he got popped for taking psoriasis medication. At least that's what he said. But you look at how he blew up after after he left the UFC. And you have to wonder also now for Alex Volkanovski, an active fighter, somebody who has been knocked out now. I believe that was the second knockout loss, but he's 36 or so years of age, and he's going to be stepping in to fight Ilya Topuria, who is not going to take it easy on Alex Volkanovski. So, man, it's you have to wonder when's the right time to walk away. And then we've gotten this far into the conversation, and we haven't talked about Randy Couture, somebody who was able to persevere the natural into his mid-40s. And I don't think USADA was around when he was in his prime. And he's had multiple primes. You talk about fighters who have had multiple primes. These is deep thoughts with Mike's MMA picks. And a fighter's had multiple primes is not only Randy Couture, but Alistair Overeem. You saw the original Overeem, then you saw Ubereem, and then you ended up seeing Econoreem towards the end of his career. And you saw the way he disposed of Sergey Pavlovich. Impressive in that regard. And he's since retired and lost tremendous amounts of muscle mass. This is Alistair Overeem. So the pharmaceutical companies may have been helping him out accomplish many of those goals. And we know the horse meat has been a huge component of his diet through the years, right? Bigfoot Silva is a fighter who his chin checked out many, many, many years ago. I was at Bigfoot Silva's fight against Fedor, and we saw Bigfoot Silva walk out victorious there. And I remember Fedor, the beating he took, incredible. Fedor may have been better off retiring at that moment in time. Then how about Andrei Arlovsky, who's competing, I believe, at UFC Vegas 84, or is it UFC 297? Andrei Arlovsky is still going, and that's someone who was brutally knocked out in their first professional fight. Go back. I challenge you to go back to Andrei Arlovsky's first professional fight and watch what unfolded. And somehow, someway, he had a very successful UFC career. By the way, if you wouldn't mind subscribing to the channel while you have a moment, and also leaving a comment in the comment section for the video, that'll be very helpful. And I want to thank everybody for tuning in today, and as we enjoy a tasty beverage and some deep thoughts regarding fighter retirements and when fighters hang on too long. So let's continue talking here. An active fighter, I'll share an active fighter who I believe potentially has hung on a little too long, even though he's extremely talented, is Julian Erosa, Juicy J. Juicy J is a fighter who he's just been knocked out many, many times, and it's striking defense has always been an issue for Erosa. He's extremely talented. I remember the Steven Peterson fight. You saw how deep he was willing to dig to stay in that fight and come out the other side victorious. But then you saw the fight against Bruce Leroy and the way he got knocked out. He's been knocked out many, many, many times. It's a real cause for concern. Julian Erosa. Let's continue chatting here. Let's talk about Bryce Mitchell and Josh Emmett. That situation that unfolded recently at UFC 296 is something that sticks with me. You saw Bryce Mitchell convulsing on the canvas, and the camera panned to him as he was getting up on his own, under his own power, and he left the octagon under his own power, which is really, it blew my mind to see that, to be honest. You wonder the long-term effects of sustaining that level of punishment inside the octagon. And I go back to the Twitter account that I have, Mike's MMA Picks, where I posed a question about the damage that you've seen inside the octagon, and what is the most amount of damage you've seen. And I'm going to go back to some of these responses. Who, in your eyes, has taken the most damage inside of the UFC octagon? We've had a few. We've talked about Darren Elkins. We've talked about Tony Ferguson. Calvin Kattar at the hands of, and not necessarily the feet of Max Holloway, but the hands of Max Holloway. And Kattar came back, and man, the way he turned the tables on Giga Chikadze, not many folks expected that. Chris Montano, Lauren Murphy, that is the truth. Paige Van Zandt, Big Steve mentions. Interesting. Wow. Junior Dos Santos. Gugabe mentions Junior Dos Santos. Yes. The Cain Velasquez fights. That is something that those were life-changing beatings. Those were truly life-changing beatings. You saw Jair Rosenstruck and many, many, many others have their way with Junior Dos Santos. And JDS in his prime could have given a lot of these fighters a run for their money or just blown them out of the water, but he hung on way, way, way too long. And you watch, I believe he fought Fabricio Verdum recently, and Verdum was a fighter who retired and came back a totally different beast. But did the pharmaceutical companies help him out? Let's see. So we talk about, how about Brian Ortega? Brian Ortega, both of those fighters, Calvin Kattar and Brian Ortega, were fed to Max Holloway. And you talk about Max Holloway as well. Max Holloway is a fighter who has set the record for most significant strikes absorbed and most significant head strikes absorbed in UFC history. Incredible stat to fathom. And Holloway, he knows, I believe it's been brought to his attention, and he's still a younger guy in the fight game, even though he's had so many fights under his belt. And what's scary is you have Josh Emmett asking for a fight with Max Holloway. And I know Max can get clipped. He can get hit. As we've seen, Arnold Allen was able to land on him. If Josh Emmett lands on Max Holloway, that might not end well. But the thing is, you also have to be concerned about Josh Emmett's lack of volume. And who is the volume king? Max Holloway. Max Holloway has blown folks out of the water as far as the number of significant strikes landed. Let's see. So we have Tony Ferguson, Clay Guida. Also, Clay Guida has over 50 professional fights, I believe Clay Guida does. And he hasn't been knocked out that often, but he's been submitted a number of times. And the mileage you saw you saw against Neto BJJ recently, that the mileage is starting to pile up on him. Now, let's see. BJ Penn, Nate Diaz. Nate Diaz. Nate Diaz, I do not consider Nate Diaz an elite fighter whatsoever. He outlasts a lot of opponents, and he's tough as nails. Don't get me wrong. Let's see. You're right. Colin says BJ Penn took a lot of damage at the end of his career. I agree. You saw the Nick Diaz fight against BJ Penn, and that was a fight. Oh my God. It's sad. It's honestly sad sometimes to watch these fighters who, in their prime, they could have handled their opponent, but they just hung on way too long. And when it comes to having deep thoughts about this, you kind of wish that certain situations lent itself to these fighters making great decisions with their money. And I was listening to Mac McAnally, he was Jimmy Buffett's guitarist, songwriter, and he was talking about music folks in the music industry who sign contracts, who are young and new to the profession, but want to have their dreams come true. And they'll do anything to have their dreams come true. And a lot of fighters, they'll do anything for their dreams to come true. So they'll sign these contracts that potentially aren't in their best interests. And the music industry is the same way. So you wonder if somebody's signing a 12 and 12, like $12,000 to show and 12,000 to win, and they get the crap beat out of them for 15 minutes. I mean, they signed on the dotted line. They wanted their dreams to come true. But also, as a fan, I'm sitting there, I pay, a few $100 in the seat, and I'm watching this all unfold, and I'm rooting, and I may have money invested, but betting on a fighter. It's sometimes it isn't fair. Sometimes life isn't fair. And you watch these fights, and you want to see these fighters get compensated fairly. And man, my heart goes out to a lot of these fighters who bust their butts, and they really try with all their might to win and do whatever it takes to walk away victorious. And that a lot of times means sacrificing themselves in the process. And I mentioned about 15, 20 high profile fighters who've really given everything they've had to make their dreams come true. And sometimes, as I mentioned earlier, you get to the end of your contract and you're shot to bits. You're getting old, and you're making the I believe the $50,000 fight bonus. I don't know how long. I remember it being $50,000 in, I think, the 90s. It was $50,000. Now we're in 2024. So hopefully um, there's some inflation there where fighters can make a little bit more when it comes to that. But as somebody who has been an avid fan, and I mean an avid fan, I've watched this fight game so closely since the early 1990s. I've watched the sport basically grow up. I remember going to Pride Fighting Championships, and there were only a few people at the weigh-ins, and the fighters, they were approachable. You could chat with folks like they were right there, cutting weight in front of you. That was pretty nuts. Um, and then to be at the fighter buffet the night before the fights after weigh-ins, everybody accessible, the entire Shooter Box team, and even ran into Butterbean out of all people. He had his plate full, I'll say that. Sergey Karatanov, all these other fighters in Pride Fighting Championships also. Um, you watch the way things were handled over there as well. Um, with the head stomps and what have you. There were fighters who were brutally injured in their respective bouts. Who remembers when Ricardo Arona was fighting Sakuraba, and Sakuraba's eyes were completely swollen shut? He was basically fighting for his life in that fight. It was incredible. We talked about Spencer Fisher. We talked about Bryce Mitchell. Oh, how about Donald Cerrone? Donald Cerrone, company man who would step up on short notice. And Kevin Holland's cut from the same cloth, but Donald Cerrone took his fair share of ass whoopings, to be honest. He showed up and he either walked away victorious, and most of the time he walked away victorious. But then you watch his fight against RDA, the fight against RDA, my God. And also you watch RDA's fight against Anthony Pettis. That run for Rafael Dos Anjos. Rafael Dos Anjos, by the way, has been in the fight game forever. And he's somebody who has been through the meat grinder time and time and time again. I don't know why he hasn't retired, to be honest. I'm hoping that RDA can just ride off into the sunset, but he still wants that McGregor fight. Like, he came pretty close. And then Nate Diaz came in after he broke his foot. But you think about all these fighters who they're legends of the sport. They deserve our respect. They really do. And they should be held up high for all of the sacrifices that they made to raise the level of the sport. And that's really what they did. Randy Couture's, et cetera, of the sport. Let's see. So we saw JDS, Shannon Ross. Oh my God. Shannon Ross beaten pillar to post multiple times. Never walked away with the win. Shane Burgos is a fighter who busted his ass. And man, I was at his fight against Charles Jourdain, who will be competing at UFC 297, a free play I put out there when the line was fresh, was Charles Jourdain at minus 115 for the most recent fight that he's about to have. But Shane Burgos is someone who sacrificed himself for the UFC, and now he's in PFL, and he's run into some problems. Tony Ferguson versus Cerrone, eye shit was bad, looked terrible. Yeah. It was Cerrone's eye that blew up. Remember, he blew his nose. I believe that was at Madison Square Garden. RDA versus Gamrot coming up too. Surprised by that matchmaking. Yeah, I know. It's the wrestling, man. He gets put behind the eight ball against these grinders. And that fight, at least it's at 155 pounds and not 170 pounds for RDA. Let's see. So we got Joanna, former champion. Joanna, former champion, beaten brutally. She ended up trying to come back, and Weili Zhang was able to tune her up. Darren Elkins, we already talked about Darren Elkins. Oh wow, this is a good one. Michelle Waterson. Michelle Waterson against Marina Rodriguez. Marina Rodriguez, the way that fight ended, oh my gosh. The karate hottie was beaten and brutalized. Wasn't a good look, but hey, she went out on her terms. And sometimes that's the way these fighters want it to be, right? Don't break the fight up until I'm knocked out. Dominic Cruz, remember the Henry Cejudo fight? He's still mad, still angry at no nonsense Keith Peterson. You hear Dominic Cruz every time Peterson's inside the octagon. It's like, oh, this guy, we've got a grudge. We got a grudge. We're holding it against him. He cost him his title, and Dominic Cruz, yes, to a certain degree, he has a point. But then you also have situations like the TJ Dillashaw fight where he told, I think, Herb Dean in the back that my shoulder might pop out and just let the fight go. I'll pop it back in. Come on. That was, by the way, Dillashaw, the way he handled that was a horrific look. Talk about deep thoughts. I'm being brutally honest. That was horrific to watch our buddy TJ Dillashaw hold up a division and basically steal a title fight opportunity. That was disgusting. And now he's retired and hopefully gone from the sport forever. Even though he was talented, he's a vessel that Dwayne Ludwig really helped out. But the way he brutalized Henan Barao and also the EPO, horrible look. And then to sit there with the shoulder injury and take the fight, even though it had been dislocated, what did he say, 20 plus times during the camp? Come on now. So we talked Diego Sanchez. Let's see. Chris Martino, Elkins, Charlie Ontiveros. My God, do you remember Ontiveros versus Holland and the sound that Ontiveros was making when he got slammed? Yes, it did set the entire division back with TJ Dillashaw. Well said. Embarrassing moment for the UFC to go through with that TJ Aljo fight. That was a disgrace. It really was. Let's see. Frankie Edgar. I keep going back to Frankie, man. Frankie busted his butt for the sport. And the Korean zombie fight, that was rough. One fight I really wanted to see take place, believe it or not, was Alex Volkanovski versus Frankie Edgar. This was a fight that could have and should have been made, but Frankie caught the line and ended up taking a fight against Korean Zombie. And what should have happened there was nature should have taken its course, and we should have seen Frankie Edgar take on Alex Volkanovski. And unfortunately, it didn't happen. So leave your comments in the comment section if you wouldn't mind. I see there are a bunch of folks watching right now, but if you wouldn't mind, post in the comments section a fight that really irked you, and it was just a tactical unfair advantage that a fighter came into the fight with and used leverage, whether it be a weight advantage, like we already saw our a fighter who I bet on, Christian Rodriguez, tremendously skilled fighter, but the Cameron Simon bout, you saw how much a tremendous, significant weight advantage helped Christian Rodriguez in that bout. Now, I think that Christian Rodriguez is a very talented fighter. I think that he has a very bright future, and I have a hunch that the UFC may end up having him compete next at featherweight. But I do think that he should be competing at bantamweight. It's just a matter of shedding those last few pounds. It's easy for me to say as I'm downing a beverage here. Let's see what else we got here. McGregor, Khabib took his soul. There's no recovery from that. Interesting. Max Holloway, Marvin Vettori. My God, how many strikes did Marvin Vettori take against Jared Cannonier. And you want to talk about a fighter who should have walked away a long time ago? Melvin Gillard. Melvin Gillard, I believe, was still competing until recently. Wild. Wild how that's continued to happen. Now we've talked about, oh, how about Anthony Smith? Anthony Smith, that Ryan Spann bout, I think gave him some false hope heading into this most recent fight that he fought. And we saw Anthony Smith, his career seems to be done at this point. And I'm not sure. I don't think he officially retired, but I wouldn't be surprised to see Anthony Smith walk away from the sport with a tremendous amount of fights under his belt. So let's see. Rice says he hated when Aljo backpacked Piotr Jan twice and couldn't submit him. I had the human backpack by sub and couldn't bring home the bacon. So you didn't have Aljo straight. You didn't have the money line on Aljo. You just had Aljo by sub. Wow, that's a tough beat. That's a tough one to swallow there. My heart goes out to you. Yeah, that was tough. And by the way, Piotr Jan, he's a fighter who was supposed to he came pretty darn close. We saw against Uriah Faber and others how talented he is, but when he faces these grapplers and these fighters who are going to pressure him, like Merab Dvalishvili, he runs into some serious issues. And I'm concerned for Piotr Jan. I believe he's fighting Song Yadong, which is going to be a fantastic fight. But I'll be honest, I think that Piotr Jan's a very small bantamweight. I think that he could be competing at 125 pounds if he really wanted to. Extremely talented fighter. So we spent about close to 45 minutes here talking about fighters getting close to retirement and when is the right time to walk away. No fan should be telling a fighter when it's time to retire, but when you have visual evidence in front of you, I mean, these fighters, they have sometimes 6 months or a year in between fights. You have to run the tape at some point and see that if you're getting brutally knocked out 3 consecutive times, 4 consecutive times, or you're getting just thrashed like a rag doll for 3, 4, 5, 6 consecutive fights, the writing's on the wall. I don't know how folks don't walk away unless there's some sort of monetary contributor that is in the equation here. So the key here, honestly, the key for me at the end to end this podcast is that I have so much respect for the fighters who compete inside of the octagon for our viewing pleasure on a regular basis. And it is the most exciting, the most exhilarating sport. Everything hangs in the balance. Fighters, when they lose, oftentimes they pay for it with their consciousness. And it's a very volatile sport, but it's also a beautiful sport too. And it should be respected. And I respect anyone and anybody associated with the UFC and the fighters who enter the octagon. It's incredible that they're able to do so. And it is a gladiator mindset that we see a lot of these fighters possess. So grateful for them, grateful for you for tuning in here. If you wouldn't mind taking the time to subscribe to the channel, that would be a big help for us, as I've mentioned. And remember to go get what's yours. I'll have a new video out tomorrow, and we'll keep this thing rolling. So cheers, and thanks again, my brothers. Have a great evening. Take care, my friends. Let's continue down the road.